Really looking forward to having an interesting conversation today with Cutty Felton from the Accidental Counsellor. I think we're in a time when many of our customers are experiencing cost of living problems, and at the same time we've got our frontline support staff looking after them. So timely that we have this conversation. So Cutty, tell me a little bit about you and the Accidental Counsellor.
Well, I guess at Accidental Counsellor, what we really do is we support organisations like yours to train not only their leaders, but frontline staff as well in those skills that we need when the people that we're talking to, whether those be colleagues or clients, really are struggling. Sometimes they're incredibly angry, sometimes they're totally overwhelmed. Often actually at the moment, they're quite excruciatingly vulnerable. And we look at how do we respond to that in a way that is ethical, in a way that's appropriate, that's deeply compassionate, but also a way that is within very carefully defined boundaries. Because as staff members, we aren't therapists or counsellors. We also can't take on the role of, I guess, long-term trusted friend or family member to that person. So the boundaries within which we work are incredibly important. And that's not only for the safety of the client or our colleague, but that's very much for our own safety as well, and organisational safety too. And then, of course, all of that is done, particularly, for instance, when I'm working with your teams, in the context of the relevant, I guess, provisions of the banking or superannuation or insurance codes of practice, but also taking into account those regulations that have recently changed regarding work health and safety around psychosocial hazards and risks. So all of those are really important themes in the training that we do. Now, a little bit about me. Well, I guess I came to this whilst I was working as a solicitor, both in private practice and also in the corporate world, because I started to realize that although I had all of the skills, the knowledge that I needed to practice law, essentially, there was something that was missing for me. And what was missing were those really human skills. Those ones when my colleagues were struggling, sometimes totally overwhelmed, or when my clients were had perhaps experienced some huge trauma. As I say, were very often so vulnerable. So I started looking around at ways in which to build those skills, and I chose to do that by joining Lifeline.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So I worked for... Yeah. I worked, as you know, I mean, it's such a valuable experience, and I did that for many, many years as a volunteer telephone crisis supporter on that 13, 11, 14 line. I also mentored and held various other positions as well.
So that generated the interest even further.
Absolutely, and it also allowed me to combine my experiences, the experiences on the line as well as within my legal practice, to then build a specific approach and models and frameworks which we could use in those moments where we really are representing our organisation. But the people that we're dealing with are struggling, they really are. And an approach that has a framework of safety around it, that has a corporate and a legislative lens applied to it as well. So that's how I came to do what I do now.
And that's pretty important that we make sure we adhere to those codes and policies and regulations, but go above and beyond if we can. Now, I mean, I think as I mentioned, our customers are struggling at the moment, and you can hear that on the phones, and there's different levels of vulnerability there. But tell me about the things you will say to our employees to make sure they protect themselves.
I guess that first of all, it's the boundaries that we talk about, and there are 3 boundaries. The first is the boundary to our role. You know, given that I can't and should never be tempted to take on that counsellor or therapist type role, what is the boundary of my role? The next boundary we talk about is the boundary to the conversations that we have. You know, at what stage is this conversation with my customer going to go from being genuinely supportive and compassionate to inadvertently potentially creating additional harm, not only to the customer, but to us as well. And then the third boundary is the boundary, you know, around policy and process and procedure. So that is really important. But I think I perhaps bring a slightly different perspective as well, because the well-being of our staff is of paramount importance.
Absolutely agree.
It's the top thing. And the one thing that I say that has the most people in the room nodding vigorously is when I tell them that in our context, I'm never going to mention the word resilience to them. Because our people are human. The last thing we want is for them to in some way lose their humanity in their role.
I think that's very important.
Yeah. And so it's not about ever, feeling that they're a failure because they're not resilient enough, and when people feel that, it's a huge barrier to them seeking support when they need it. So it's not about that. It's about finding ways in which we can reduce the impact of perhaps that client's stress or trauma or whatever they're going through on us. And then when we are affected because we're human, it's about having certain strategies in place. What can I do to essentially decompress in some way?
Doesn't become a more serious issue.
And when it does become a serious issue,
ask for help.
Exactly. And identifying where do I get that, and what does that look like for me? Yeah.
And fortunately we have lots of programs like that.
Exactly.
So, I mean, you've been doing this for a while. What are you seeing happening in the companies and people that you support at the moment out there?
Yeah. I guess that we haven't only had a pandemic. We've had, I don't know how many natural disasters. We've had, as everyone knows, the spiraling interest rates, cost of living pressures. It's not only our clients who are struggling, but it's actually our staff members as well. So that has brought with it a level of exhaustion, really, that I'm seeing in teams, and this is across every sector that I deal with. There's a lot of cynicism as well. So now we're getting to the point where people are starting to say to me things like, well, everybody knows these days that if you just allege some kind of vulnerability, you'll be treated differently. Or they'll say, I'm hearing all of these things from people, but I'm sure they're just trying to manipulate me in some way. And that's yeah.
Have you seen that before?
It's really grown exponentially over the last 3 years. It's become very... Now, I'm never going to try and persuade anybody that every single person they deal with is, as pure as the driven snow, because realistically they're not. But that's the reason why the conversations we have in the training are so important. Why we talk about what supports you in those moments. Why, for instance, the processes that you have in place are there not only for the protection or the safety of your customer or of the organization actually, but how they really protect you as well. We talk about the boundaries, and I have to say the biggest piece of feedback, or the most frequent piece of feedback I get around all of that, is people will come back to me in the weeks or months, sometimes literally years after I've trained them, and they'll say, when I really absorbed and truly understood the reasons why I'm working within those boundaries, it lifted such a weight off my shoulders. It came as a huge relief. But those are very prevalent, and that feeling of being manipulated is very prevalent right now.
Yeah, and you can imagine the impact that has. So if you had one word of advice for our frontline people who do a very important job in our organisation, what would it be?
Your own self-care is the priority. That doesn't mean the last thing you do at the end of the week when you have time. It is the priority. It's not a luxury. And certainly not in the work that they're doing, which is incredibly difficult work.
It is. Yeah. So thank you very much, Cutty. Very interesting conversation, I think very pertinent in these times. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.